Colleagues, friends, family, and the class of 2010, let me begin by saying how honored I am to be talking to you today. Being selected by the students to deliver the final lecture is for me an honor of extraordinary magnitude, and I want you to know that it will always represent one of the high points of my career at Auburn. And as I prepared for the talk today, I found myself thinking more and more about my own years in college and why and how they had shaped my life so profoundly. Of course, those years imparted a certain body of knowledge and a specific set of skills that I used as I went on to build my career. But the experience of college was so much more than the basis of a career. It was in college that I came for the first time to have a real awareness of my own identity. And more to the point for my purposes today, how I had and would continue to construct that identity, which really brings me to the subject of my talk, which is the Western idea of self-construction and its corollary, individualism. In the West, we celebrate the concept of the individual, and historically we've come to believe, or so it's been argued, that the individual is a construction, that the individual has consciously taken steps to develop a unique persona. The concept of the individual has become, for Western culture, a very important cultural and political value. And we still, after all this time, believe in the possibility of the self-made person, even in the face of overwhelming historical forces and contingencies. And attendant values include self-initiative and personal responsibility. These come with the territory. My talk is going to be about self-construction and actually how it played out in early modern France. Please indulge me. Indulge me in some instruction from the past, and this may be your final history lecture. I first considered the idea of the individual as a work of art when I was an undergraduate at Hendrix College in Arkansas. My advisor was a man by the name of Garrett McCainch. He was a historian of early modern Europe, and he was the college professor that had the greatest impact on me. I had enrolled in his class on Renaissance Europe, and he'd assigned us to read a book by a 19th century historian, Jacob Burckhardt's 2-volume work on the civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And that's a really famous historical work that probably more than any other book shapes what we think still to this day about the Renaissance and the birth of modern individualism. Specifically, he wrote that in this period, the individual came to be perceived as a work of art, that is, as something constructed, not born. This idea made me think very differently and frankly creatively about my own life, and set me on a course that, among other things, brought me to Auburn 28 years ago. To argue that the modern idea of the uniqueness of the individual dates in the West to the Renaissance is perhaps a difficult pill for my dearest friend, Dr. Kicklighter, and his fellow medievalists to swallow. Medievalists like to maintain that it happened first in the Middle Ages. The medieval period was more corporate in nature. One's identity was linked to a group, to the nobility, to a village, to the town, to a guild, etc. And it's been argued that one didn't think of oneself as an independent entity until the period of the Renaissance. And of course, that's when Burckhardt argued that modern individualism began. Classicists would remind us that Renaissance individualism was actually a revival of the concept as it occurred first among the Greeks and the Romans. After all, it was Greek philosophers like Socrates who began to address the idea of the inner conscience and inner goodness of the individual. And certainly Renaissance scholars were inspired by Greek and Roman philosophers as they emphasized individual consciousness. Well, working hand in hand with the cultural celebration of the individual were Renaissance educational theories. The scholars of Renaissance Italy, who were known as humanists, argued that education was to promote virtue as well as knowledge, and more to the point, it was to promote the individual. By the curriculum they proposed, they prepared the student for life. They didn't just give the student a set of technical skills. And by the concept of what we know today as the liberal arts, or also known as the traditional arts and sciences, humanist educators of the period sought to cultivate the whole person and to do so in a way that preserved and developed further his or her unique qualities. Renaissance society cherished the qualities that identified people individually, and with that they also celebrated the idea of self-construction. They believed these qualities were necessary to make one's way in the world. And that's a recurring theme in the Renaissance and later, the idea of constructing one's life, oneself. Along with this cultural value came a celebration of legendary examples of self-construction, of individuals, at this time mostly men, who carved lives of success and fame for themselves, as they did by their basic talents and ability. And the Italians held up these spectacular examples, like people like Da Vinci or Michelangelo, to inspire and celebrate this cultural value. So, in the period of the Renaissance, individualism, self-construction, or sometimes it's called self-fashioning, emerged as Western cultural values. Historians of the Reformation era have argued in turn that the reform movements, both Protestant and Catholic, promoted the further development of the concept of the individual by the primacy they assigned to one's interior spiritual life. Martin Luther believed that salvation was the result of an individual's faith rather than the intervention of the clergy, and his reforms placed great weight on the interior spiritual world of the believer. Along similar lines, the Catholic Reformation saw the church give more emphasis to the individual and adopt reforms that focused on his or her interior spiritual life. Both movements promoted an awareness of the individual in their efforts to reform Christian piety and practices. Probably one of the greatest stimuli for the development of a culture that lauded the individual and ideas of personal responsibility and agency came with the advent of the printing press and significant increases in literacy. This too happened in the early modern period, and it really sort of shadowed the Reformation. Certainly reading was a way in which a person liberated himself or herself from the group or from a more traditional cultural environment. And the invention of printing made the production of books cheaper, faster, and gave more people access. Francis Bacon described the printing press as one of the three great inventions that had changed the appearance of the world. The other two happened to be gunpowder and the compass. But at any rate, literacy rates increased dramatically between 1500 and 1800. Moreover, new ways of reading became popular at the same time. More and more people came to read silently, away from others. What you saw in this period was the privatization of reading. That's one of the major cultural developments of the early modern period. And so reading not only opened up an interior world from the individual, it would also give them one of the major tools for self-construction. Reading and education expanded, of course, career options and made more successful or famous careers, and it offered access to other social worlds. In fact, frankly, no tool could have been more valuable to self-construction. I'd also like to throw in, though, that civility and the rise of etiquette likewise promoted individualism and self-construction in this period. The early modern period saw a growing awareness of how a person conducted himself or herself in public, and therefore the growth of a prescriptive literature. This is when the etiquette book appears, and it was to provide guidance for the individual as he or she made as the individual made his or her way in public. The use of individual plates, forks, spoons, knives, rather than eating from a common bowl, for example, was to create a protected zone around around each person. When Erasmus published a book entitled Manners for Children in 1530, it became a guide for public behavior. And one of its foremost principles was the idea that outward glances and conduct should never reveal what one is actually thinking. Again, the interior world of the person was special and private. It's a world apart from the densely populated public space. And to conduct oneself in public according to a prescribed code of conduct now became part of the carefully constructed path to social and political success. So, by the 16th century, certainly, self-construction and individualism were values that were already deeply embedded in European culture. And they were values with very tangible results in that they promoted social mobility. This was a period that saw significant increases in upward social mobility. Although it was a hierarchically arranged society, it was not rigidly so. And just as people could move from place to place, so they could move up and down the social ladder. And ambitious individuals could advance socially through self-construction. This was essential. Obviously, careers promoted social advancement, but education and lifestyle did as well. Well, all of this, you may be wondering where I'm heading, brings me to a consideration of the individual and personal achievement within the historical population that I know best, the nobility of early modern France. I've spent my career as a historian studying this group. This is a social group, or I should say a collection of individuals that were in the midst of crisis in the 16th century. By crisis, I mean that they were seeing a decline in aristocratic power and money and frankly just in their numbers. They were supposed to have experienced a major erosion of political and social and economic power and to have been overtaken by the rapidly rising middle class. Why a crisis? Well, there's several reasons. Briefly, one had to do with changes in warfare and the advent of gunpowder, and the rise of the common ordinary infantrymen, which sort of undermined their whole reason for being. Then there was just the fact that families were dying out, either through, as a result of warfare or just attrition over time. And they were losing out financially as well to the more capitalistically oriented merchant class who knew much better how to manage money. But finally, and I think most importantly for our purposes today, they were ignorant and even illiterate in many cases in an age of rising literacy. Many commented about this, that they knew about how to be a warrior, but they knew nothing about letters. Well, this became a subject of historical debate and controversy. For historians who wrote in the first half of the 20th century, all of the evidence everything I just explained to you meant the end of the nobility and the meteoric rise of the middle class. But interestingly, a later generation of historians of the post-World War II era, many of whom had fought in Europe and the Pacific and earned their PhDs afterwards on the GI Bill, challenged this interpretation and a lot of other interpretations as well, and I think brought to the table a much more nuanced and complex understanding of what was actually happening to the aristocracy. Among them, my advisor, Russell Major, who'd been a forward observer with Patton's artillery and came home from Europe a highly decorated combat veteran. Back from the war, he completed a PhD at Princeton in 3 years and proceeded to embark on a career as a scholar and teacher that changed the way we thought about the nobility and crisis, and in fact the state. And what Major and his generation did was to challenge orthodoxy and to revise the way we looked at the nobility and related issues. They instead talked about social mobility, and for them, everything that was happening to the nobility took on different meaning. They saw these changes as part of a larger transformation of the nobility and society as a whole, an evolution that actually enlarged and preserved the nobility, albeit in a more modern, complex form. For them, they talked about the reconstitution of the nobility. They believed that was taking place because, and here's the point I'm trying to get to, the dynamic interaction of personal choice and historic circumstances. And why did this generation, this post-World War II generation, or actually World War II generation, look at the same group of people and see construction and transformation where an earlier generation of historians had only seen crisis? And I think that Major and his generation were inclined to interpret these historical changes differently as reconstitution and self-construction, precisely because of their experiences in World War II. The war, whether experienced as a soldier or not, forever shaped their understanding of the relationship between the individual and the context, between agency and contingency. These post-war scholars were themselves spectacular examples of self-construction and reconstruction, who as individuals had confronted in Europe and the Pacific overwhelming historical forces. And for them, this vital transformation of the nobility rested, of course, primarily on education. The 16th century had seen many critics write about the nobility's ignorance and anti-intellectualism. They talked about how backward the old families were. This was the subject of numerous pamphlets and treatises in the 16th century. But the deal is that the nobility began finally to get with the program, finally to view education as necessary to rehabilitate themselves. Families began sending their sons off to newly founded schools just for them, or to universities to become attorneys. And an important outcome of all of this was that the nobility came to be associated, as it has been in more recent times, with education, refinement, ambition, and careers. Education was then the essential tool of self-construction. But the question was, how do you interest a young nobleman who's used to, spending his time, jousting and practicing the art of warfare? How do you get him interested in books and education? How to draw them into the culture of letters? Warfare was, in fact, the hook. A young nobleman first read about the art of warfare, and in the lessons of war, he encountered the great lessons of life, that is, of history. By studying warfare, nobles now learned about letters, and they were asked to read classical treatises and contemporary treatises. And then they went on to study history and philosophy and music, because culture and knowledge now became a sign of nobility. And in this context, I should add, language assumed special importance. The ideal aristocrat was well-spoken, someone who was good at the fine art of conversation. So all this meant that the culture of nobility evolved significantly in the 16th century as nobles consciously changed themselves. And there was a very practical benefit from this change. Education and self-construction prepared young nobles for service to the state, for government offices and political power. And this was the era of big government. To gain and maintain political power, noble families had to control government offices. And in the context of rapidly growing government, political opportunities, and the public sphere, the nobility came to define itself in terms of ambition. And they used the concept of ambition to describe their own lives. And we know this because they wrote about it. By the 17th century, they're writing memoirs and letters and diaries, etc., that talk about how they feel about their lives. Ambition and self-construction emerged as a central theme in their memoirs. The Catholic military hero Blaise de Montluc, whose memoirs are now considered some of the earliest examples of autobiography in the West, wrote that ambition and social advancement were the guiding themes of his life. He'd actually been born into a noble family that had fallen on hard times financially, and confronted with that, he decided he was going to have to make his own way in the world, that he'd have to do so as a warrior. He first fought in the wars in Italy. You may remember, we talked about those in world history. Then he went on to become a Catholic commander in the French Wars of Religion. We talked about that as well. And in fact, he actually rose to the highest rank in the French army. And he wrote about seeing the sons of poor farmers advance farther than many noblemen through their own talent, through their own bravery and their own virtue. And he believed that even though he was an aristocrat, he still had to succeed step by step, like the poorest soldier in the kingdom. Despite his inherited status, and in the face of particular historical circumstance, Montluc was proud of his own story, that through his own skill and hard work as a warrior, he'd risen to become Marshal of France. And he held this out as a goal for other young men. Well, Montluc and others like him expected then not just to grow into their positions and social roles, but to create them as they advanced in life. Ambition became a social norm. They believed ambition made a better person. That's not to suggest that any educated person of the 16th and 17th century was indifferent to the role of context either. In the 16th, 17th century, they called it fortune. They knew that this played a role, that context played a huge role in shaping the life of the individual. They knew full well that talent and ability interacted, and not always successfully, with context, with fate, with contingency. La Rochefoucauld, in writing about the career of one nobleman, said, and I'm quoting him, "His ambitions rested on all the qualities that ought to have secured success. He was valiant and had a perfect knowledge of warfare. He had an easy, natural, ingratiating eloquence. His mind was clear, inventive, and capable of untangling the most difficult matters. But such great advantages were often of no use to him because of the stubbornness of his fortune, which almost always opposed his prudence." For La Rochefoucauld, there was always the vexing problem of forces beyond one's control, forces that set limits on the individual. More constrained by fortune and context, of course, were noble women in the early modern period, which was, after all, a patriarchal society. But I would argue that still, ideas about ambition and success and individualism featured in their lives. There are numerous examples of women using their own property or that of their husbands to act as patrons and to leverage political and military outcomes in the 16th and 17th century. The period includes some spectacular examples of social mobility among elite women. And certainly it produced prominent female writers who explored through their literary efforts their identity and relation to the relationship of the individual to context. Madame de Sévigné, the greatest epistolary writer of Louis XIV's France, wrote about her life and world in letters that have have come to be treasured by all who study this period. In the 16th, 17th century, so many people plotted and constructed their social and professional ascent that the French playwright Molière satirized the phenomenon in his very famous play, The Bourgeois Gentleman. He wrote about a middle-aged, would-be gentleman, Monsieur Jourdain, who was newly rich, who'd hired a tutor to teach him how to dress, to teach him how to dance, to teach him how to behave. But his teachers all made fun of him. His tailor, for example, would dress him up in outfits that included shoes so tight that it caused him to limp. His dancing master taught him how to bow by having him walk backward with a skip and a hop to bow. And all of this his tutors thought was hysterically funny. In fact, finally, his wife has to tell him that he's become a joke. He's totally exposed. And this was in the 17th century, one of Molière's most successful comedies, because at this point, Europe's actually stepping back a bit and laughing at itself. It's acknowledged the current of social mobility and self-fashioning. Well, this story of self-construction or reconstruction of the individual and consequently an entire social group is obviously important to our understanding of the early modern world. But its relevance beyond this, what is its relevance beyond the scholarly debates of historians? Frankly, most people will remain unaware of the reconstitution of the French aristocracy. It's just a blip on the historical radar screen. Nor will those who do know about it, and that's namely my own students, find their lives all that enriched by that knowledge. But for me personally, this is not just the subject of my scholarly career. This is a story of spectacular self-construction, human agency, and response to crisis. It's a manifestation of a larger trend within Western culture. This is the period in which the idea of self-construction became firmly ingrained in the Western imagination. This is the period in which the West came to place a real premium on the individual. By responding to their critics, to the challenge of the so-called crisis, these French aristocrats self-constructed and reconstructed. And they did so consciously, and they told us about it in their diaries, their letters, their memoirs, and their autobiographies. Now, I would be remiss if I did not say that the Western self is not entirely unique. There's plenty of evidence, for example, in Asian history, to point to similar traditions elsewhere. I think it's also worth pointing out that Western individualism has its critics and its downside, not the least of which is the tendency to narcissism and indifference to the common good. And finally, I want to note that the culture that we live in is not strictly Western, that it is significantly more multicultural now than it was when our nation was first established. But still, the Western values of self-construction and individualism continue to inform our expectations and goals. My life has been blessed with inspirational examples of self-construction and individualism, not the least of which are my parents, Donald and Jean Bohanan, who've been for me powerful examples of hard work, determination, self-construction in the midst of sometimes difficult, personal, and historical circumstance. They sent me to college so that I would develop as an individual. And they taught me that life is ultimately what you make of the historical hand dealt you. And then there's my husband, Frank Smith, whose lifelong learning has defined him as an individual. His inquisitiveness and intellectual energy are the artistry of his own extraordinary self-constructive process. But finally, what I hope for Auburn's senior class is that in your time here, we've assisted you in self-construction, that we've given you the tools to continue that lifelong process. You may have wondered, even lamented, those core classes, the ones that crowded your schedule your freshman and sophomore years. But those were some of the tools, the math, the science, the literature, and yes, the world history. And Auburn has been and remains committed to providing you the tools you will need to find personal and individual fulfillment and meaning in your life. After you leave Auburn and embark on careers and build families, you'll confront in a very direct way historical circumstance that will shape your lives. This may be military conflict or economic recession, hopefully not. It may be the extraordinary pace of scientific and technological change. Whatever the historical forces, we hope years from now, as you look back at your time at Auburn, that you'll see that Auburn not only gave you access to a career, but that it liberated you as an individual, that it gave you the tools to cope and to prosper, and it helped set you on the path to life as a work of art. Thank you for the privilege of speaking to you today.